our species, and to do that concurrently with the EFH review. So that would enable us to do a review and then make changes to the fishery management plans, all as part of the same process. So all of you should be familiar with the role of essential fish habitat under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, but just to remind you, EFH is those waters and substrate that are necessary for fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. The MSA also has language that notes that really ignoring habitat, fish habitat, is a risk to sustainability of our fisheries. There's direct and indirect habitat losses, and the MSA notes that those long-term threats come from the continuing loss of marine, estuarine, and other aquatic habitats. So it's very important to address issues related to fish habitat. There are very specific roles and responsibilities that are delegated both to the councils and to NIMS. Generally, for the councils, you designate EFH. You have the ability to designate habitat areas of particular concern. You produce maps to display those designations. You have text descriptions that describe essential fish habitat, and you work to minimize the adverse effects of fishing on essential fish habitat through the use of things like gear restricted areas. In the past, you've implemented tilefish gear restricted areas. And you work with partners on non-fishing activities. You also on our website have a set of habitat policies on both fishing and non-fishing activities. That's a suite of policies that was developed back in 2016, the original suite, and you've since done updates to those policies, like the wind policy was recently updated a year or two ago. NIMS really plays a large role in essential fish habitat consultations. Those consultations rely heavily on that consultation process relies heavily on the designations that you create for EFH or habitat areas of particular concern. So NOAA consults on non-fishing actions, so projects that may adversely affect EFH, so Army Corps projects that may be issuing permits, BOEM, projects for wind, that these different companies are putting out there. And NOAA works to try to develop recommendations that minimize impacts to EFH and habitat areas of concern. Councils also have the direct ability to consult on non-fishing actions. Our council has generally not gotten very directly involved in that consultation process. We've really let NIMS take the lead on that, but we've tracked those issues very carefully with our NOAA fisheries partners. However, some councils have to consult directly on impacts to diadromous fish habitat. So like on the West Coast where they deal with salmon and some of these other species, those councils have to take a direct role in that consultation process. But we do work very closely on staff, myself, and some of the others like Julia Beatty that works on wind issues with our partners. And this EFH consultation process is really important for us to consider as we develop essential fish habitat designations and habitat area of particular concern designations. Nationally, there's about 5,000 federal actions that NIMS consults on. Within our own region, we talk to GARFO, and they get about 300 actions that come through our region that they're involved in various levels of essential fish habitat consultation. That's a lot of activity impacting a lot of fish habitat. And so how we craft those designations really plays a role and can help their ability to consult on these projects. In terms of requirements, the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires review and revision of those EFH components be completed every 5 years. We have updated EFH more recently for some of our species, but we have not kept sort of that 5-year timetable for all of our designations. Some of our original species designations have been in place since 1999 when they were first implemented. So we are due for a comprehensive review of EFH. The EFH review really ensures that NOAA and the councils are using the best available information, and it provides you an opportunity to update all of those components based on new science, new products. There are specific required components for an EFH review. There's actually 10 of them that are listed in the regulatory guidance. And generally, the reviews lead to a need to revise habitat components of the fishery management plans through some sort of action. So even if you conducted an EFH review independent of an amendment, in general, you'd find changes that need to be made, and then you could then initiate an action. One of the things we're suggesting here is that we do these concurrently. So you have the ability, as you use this new information, which we know is available, you'd have the ability to immediately fold it into your fishery management plans. So here are the 10 review components. Those are also provided in the draft memo that's behind the tab in your briefing materials. So you're required to review your descriptions and identifications of EFH, fishing activities, non-fishing activities, and non-Magnuson-Stevens Act fishing activities. You need to review all of those that may adversely affect EFH. And non-Magnuson-Stevens Act fishing would be things like state water fisheries. And how those may impact habitat. You're required to do a cumulative impact analysis, consider conservation fishing impact recommendations, go through the process of identifying prey species that are associated with your fish habitat, consider habitat areas of particular concern, research needs, and consider goals and objectives and how you might incorporate those into your habitat actions. So there's a lot of things in these on this list, but we have a lot of new information to help us work through the process. So some possible outcomes. We noted some of these in the memo that's in your materials, but we would expect to have updated EFH text and map descriptions. Just as an example, I've pulled up summer flounder to kind of show you what we have and then what we may be able to work with. So summer flounder, the most recent designation was from 1999, and you have detailed text descriptions associated with that. It heavily relied on the survey information, the federal trawl survey information, as well as a few other studies like the Estuarine Living Marine Resources database that the National Ocean Service had developed. And that was the tool that helped us in terms of identifying EFH in the inshore. For summer flounder, you also identified a habitat area of particular concern back then, and that was essentially submerged aquatic vegetation. And then we produced a map, which you can see on the right of the slide. And I want to take a look at the map because I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're thinking we might be able to do. So one of the things that this map really doesn't capture is how confident we are in our ability to map EFH. So basically from Hatteras north in that offshore area, you see these little boxes turned on purple. And in the original designations, we relied on the trawl survey information. And if a 10-minute square caught a summer flounder, that turned on as essential fish habitat. But we know that there's probably summer flounder in the spaces in between a lot of those holes that we haven't really captured here. Then in the inshore for the Estuarine Living Marine Resources data, if it looked like summer flounder was found as a species in that estuary, we just turned the whole estuary on in terms of essential fish habitat. And the mapping techniques back then were not really great. So the nearshore boundary along where like the marsh edge would be was really kind of wonky in our original mapping. So in the EFH mapper that NOAA uses for consultations, they ran into issues when Army Corps would come in and try to drop a pin and say, is summer flounder EFH here? And the pin would fall in an area that just our inshore mapping quality was poor. And so it would say it's not EFH when the intent was it probably was. And then because we're doing EFH through the whole management unit, the area that is solid purple south of Hatteras looks just solid, looks like it's fantastic summer flounder habitat, when actually we didn't really have any data. So to be precautionary, that whole area just got turned on. So one of the things that we want to work through the council with is really working through our data sources and being clear about the quality of information, how confident we are in the mapping ability, and how that relates to our text descriptions and making sure that that's really well captured. So to help us with this work, on the left-hand side, we do have some model-based products that are coming out of the NERA habitat assessment. Those are based on the community basis function model and have predictive capability, looking at the probability, the likelihoods that you would find summer flounder in these areas in the fall or the spring. We can look at choosing different probability levels, combining these into a single map. We also have lots more survey information that's compiled now. So on the right-hand side, this is just a summer flounder example. We have the offshore trawl survey data in there, but we now have more detailed state surveys that are integrated. So we can take a closer look at that state survey data. So, and that'll really help us improve how we're working with this inshore information. And on the left is just a map just showing you that inshore state coverage. We're also looking right now to pull in the CMAP, some of that Southeast data to help us as we work through the amendment. Corey's been working on cleaning that up and getting that into the application. And then on the right, and I know it's small, we've actually done, using all of this updated state data, we're calling it kind of Elmer Light. We took some of the estuarine living marine resources approaches and then have applied more recent data to it so we can look at how these different species are available seasonally in the estuaries and by salinity zone and by life stage. So that'll help us, and we can pick different time periods. So if we wanted to rely on the more recent decade, rather than, I think Elmer was done in the 80s, we can pick different time periods and take a look at that information. So again, a lot more to work with now in the inshore. The other piece that you're going to need to consider is the habitat areas of particular concern. This is sort of an optional part of essential fish habitat. You can consider designating these. We only have HAPCs designated right now for 2 species, 4 canyon areas for tilefish, which have gear restricted areas that were later applied to those, and then submerged aquatic vegetation for summer flounder. And you can designate these based on ecological function, sensitivity to human-induced environmental degradation, activities that may be stressing that habitat type, or how rare that habitat type is. But our NOAA consultation partners have really indicated this is a great tool for focusing habitat conservation. As some of you may know, New England just recently went through a process of looking at habitat areas of particular concern related to some of their wind energy development activities that are going on in their region. So it's definitely a tool that I think is worth you considering, especially in the context of all of this activity occurring in our region. But I will note that these designations, HAPCs, don't confer any additional specific measures. So just because you designate an HAPC doesn't mean it automatically has fishing gear restrictions applied to it or other types of measures. It's a tool to really help increase scrutiny during these consultation processes. And it's something you could consider if you wanted to apply gear restricted measures like you did for tilefish, but that's not something that you have to do as part of that process. It's not a required part of a habitat area of particular concern. So I'll just highlight again, using this summer flounder example. One of the NERA products that we've developed is it's a climate vulnerability crosswalk where we integrated the fish habitat climate vulnerability assessment with the fish climate vulnerability assessment that was developed, both of those developed by NOAA Fisheries, as well as habitat dependency information that was available through the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership and some of the work that the Commission's done. And by integrating all of these products, we were able to map our individual species to all of these habitat types and then look at all of these climate vulnerabilities. So one thing we could consider for habitat areas of particular concern, because climate vulnerability is obviously an important piece, is maybe looking at some of these other habitat types that flag as very high or highly vulnerable for these species. So your current HAPC does already flag marine and estuarine submerged aquatic vegetation, but native salt marsh, intertidal shellfish reef, subtidal shellfish reef, and intertidal sand and mud all ranked as very high. And I know in that bottom one, when I first looked at it, I was like, sand, mud, but A lot of our species, like summer flounder, use structured like sand shoals offshore, where they do a lot of sand mining and other sort of beach renourishment activities. So sand is an important habitat for some of our species. So this is just, again, an example of one way that your fishery management action team, if you form one for this amendment, we would kind of work through this process of figuring out how to integrate some of this. So we've also talked with our NERA team and with others at NOAA Fisheries about figuring out how to make the process a little bit more adaptive and maybe even proactive, in particular in terms of some of our mapping techniques. So if we are doing these reviews every 5 years, then those EFH designations that need to be established in the FMP, the text and the maps sit static. So we could consider a process by which maps could be updated based on data more frequently than that, if they're consistent with your text EFH designations. So we get new information that helps us really improve those maps, but it's consistent with those original designations. Why not update it? We could also consider including areas where species are shifting, because we've got a lot of shifting going on. And create maybe a buffer in that direction for mapping purposes to make sure that we're not missing some of those areas that we might expect to become habitat in the next few years. And again, I earlier noted that nearshore inshore boundary for some of our map designations has created problems in some of these nearshore consultations. So just figuring out how to do that better with our partners to really make sure we're not missing consults on projects that should be occurring. In addition, there are some other tools that we've been working with our New England Council partners on. The New England Council previously developed a model called the Swept Area Seabed Impacts Model. They handed that modeling approach and those techniques off to the North Pacific Council, and they developed that model further. It was called the Fishing Effects Model. The New England Council worked through a contract. Originally, it was really like a clunky model, and it used like coding that only like one person could run, and it was really difficult to work with. So they had a contract with those folks that are out in Alaska, and they got that model all coded up in R. It's ready to run. It just needs some updated data to really get that going. So we're planning to take a closer look at that fishing effects model, and that's something that's ready to use. And when New England had that updated, they made sure that that model integrated not just New England habitat information, that it included the Mid-Atlantic as part of that process, and then included Mid-Atlantic gears, fishing gears, that may not have been captured alone if they had only used the New England gears. So we talked about this a couple of years back when they were starting this update, and felt that it made sense regionally to have like a nice functional working model that can serve both councils. So that's a tool that we're planning to use as part of this process, and can have that updated for the review. And then on non-fishing activities, obviously, things have changed in our region in recent years. Offshore wind development wasn't really an issue when many of these EFH updates occurred previously. So we would work to make sure that all the new activity, non-fishing activity, is really captured in what we're doing. So if the council chooses to do an omnibus all species EFH amendment with this concurrent 5-year review, we'd address the 10 components of the review, develop alternatives to revise any aspects of the FMP that need to be revised based on that new information. It may vary a little bit by species, but we're trying to apply the information to the extent we can in a consistent approach across those. And we would target approval and submission to the National Marine Fisheries Service in 2024. Now, I'm just going to head off a few frequently asked questions that I know we're probably going to get, or folks have asked me in the past. So the first is, aren't omnibus EFH amendments supposed to take like 15 years to do? And I know some of the folks who worked with New England on their phase 1 and phase 2 amendments, it took a really long time. So one, I want to note that a lot of the science that New England was developing was being developed concurrently while they were working through those amendments. I think in this case, we have a lot of the science developed and ready to roll out and apply. So I think if we can focus on the science that we have on hand, and not run down the rabbit hole of, I wish I had this, I wish I had that, and kind of draw that out, we can move through this process relatively quickly. And I think we need to take a pretty straightforward approach. So the extent that we can apply some of these standardized techniques across multiple species, I think makes a lot of sense for us. The other question is, once we do this, are we going to be stuck with these for another 20 years? And I really hope not, because I think if we can keep these science products updated, and then we're actively using them, like in our State of the Ecosystem report, in our stock assessment products, and they're not becoming stale, it makes it a lot easier when it's time to do another review in 5 years. We'll be able to pick this up and then develop improvements to your EFH designations through the next review. So I figured I'd just head those off right up front before we go to questions. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any questions, and then the council can consider if they'd like to take action.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. Let me look to see if anybody has their hand raised. Does anybody have any questions? Peter Hughes.
Morning, everybody. Is a 5-year review often enough? And what comes to mind is 5 years ago, wind energy was a pipe dream. Now it's all up in our, it's right there. That technology has advanced like at light speed. Is 5 years often enough to do a review on EFH, especially if we're going to go into an omnibus, which is scary to me because it's very ominous when you want to talk about omnibus. So, I mean, just with the way things are advancing, departments outside of our control, such as foam and interior, I mean, is the 5-year review often enough to review changing and going to be changing environment?
So I'm obviously it's the council's prerogative if you want to review things more frequently. I think one of the challenges for us with the EFH action and needing to move these things into the FMP, an amendment process is a very big process. So if we start this at the beginning of 2023, as it's noted in your implementation plan, I would hope by the end of 2024, we have this package moved over to the service. And it can be implemented, which will probably take another 8 months or so, for them to go ahead and implement it. And then we're almost 3 years into the process. So if the review itself leads to changes that you want to implement, I think it would be hard to do a big action like that more often. But I think that doesn't mean the information to help inform this process can't be done more often. And I think, as we've been talking as a team and noted, we'd like to see some of these things like the maps that support the consultation process maybe updated more often than that. Like maybe they can be updated every 2-3 years if these products are, we get new information. And again, if it's consistent with what you've previously developed for text descriptions, if we get better data, being able to use that, and that would help inform the wind process or other non-fishing activity processes of interest. So I think as we move through this amendment, thinking through some of those mechanisms that may give you better information and better tools to use in between these reviews, I think that should be part of our process. And we're already thinking about that because we all see what's going on and it's changing very quickly. But from the amendment process, I mean, it's going to be a big lift. And frankly, after 3 years of doing it, I kind of like to take a quick break and breather on something else, and and then we pick back up.
Chris Moore.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Peter, that's an excellent question because, the 5-year review is kind of misleading. Last time we did a 5-year review was how many years ago? And so I think it would be incumbent upon us to continue to review this information every year. In fact, if you think about what Jessica just said, we have these NERA products that we've rolled out. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at the Northeast Habitat, what's the NERA stand for?
Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment,
That thing.
our Data
So-
Explorer.
Yeah, so the thing that Tori's directly involved with. So we're already talking about updating that with new information, even though we've rolled out that product data through 2019. Tori's busy collecting 2020, 2021 data from various sources. So there's this continual process that we'll be involved with. And I think that this 5-year review, it's not going to be we've stopped 5 years from now, look at it again. It's going to be a continuous thing. Find information for a particular species that says, hey council, we need to revise this EFH definition now. Right? Things look okay, but yeah, it's not going to be static. It's going to be something that we every year.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Chris, for that. It's a little more comforting. I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. Sorry.
Yeah, if you get your mind back, we'll come back to you in a few minutes. Let me go to John Almeida. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jessica, I guess, what's the approach as to jointly managed with new council? How is it done in the past? Is it we handle the ones that we're the lead on, or is it all of them across the table and we pull New England into it?
Yeah, so I think going back to how we have previously done this for like dogfish, where we're the lead on that. I know we've taken the lead on the development process for our EFH species. They've taken the lead for things like monkfish, where they've done the development. And I know there have been presentations where we've sent staff up to then present on those designations up to that partner council, so they're aware of what's being developed. And I think, Chris, you may remember, I don't know if they had motions, and they voted on it when we went up there or not, or they just let us take the lead. And so long as there were no issues, they were okay with us, folding those into our plans and them folding those into their plans. I think that's how, yeah, Chris is nodding. That's how I remember that being handled. But we have gone up and presented for those jointly managed species to make sure the other council's aware of what's being developed.
Okay, thank you for that. Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Jessica. I appreciated Peter's question and was thinking that, maybe if there's a possibility to, with respect to more frequent review, we do have amendments underway for, various FMPs. If, as we consider an action through an FMP, that we're taking a look at the mass, we're taking a look at the EFH. I mean, there's always the affected environment chapter, with any action that we do, and that might provide an opportunity to update those products as well. And then the other thing that I was curious about, just in the briefing memo, noted a habitat research plan for all council managed resources. And, based on, I think, some of what you've proposed with respect to how it could be a little bit more comprehensive and creative with these CFH designations, considering climate change impacts and shifting species. Do you have any initial thoughts on what that habitat research plan might include, and some of the partners might be to sort of help move some of those questions forward?
Well, I know in the past when we've developed these components for habitat, we've tried to make sure those are folded into the council's 5-year research plan. That's more fully developed, and that sort of elevates it up out of the plan. So it doesn't just live in, just a written FMP document, which I'm sure in your free time, you pull those out, once a week and read those and see all that detailed stuff that's in there. So I think the goal would be, now that we would be going through this comprehensive review, there are going to be questions that come up related to habitat. So it's a really good opportunity to flag those for all our managed species. And then work with Brandon and others to make sure those are all folded up into larger research plans or strategic planning opportunities within the region with our NOAA partners to make sure those have opportunities to get addressed.
If there's anyone at this table that would take out FMP reviews, it would be Dr. Duvall. Let's see. Okay, Peter seems to have gotten his mind back, so I'm going to go back to Peter again. I know I'm thinking about the thorough training that we got yesterday, and you know, I made the comment yesterday that I'm not sure that there's a way to you know, change the way that you've been doing business for a very long time. So Peter, this is your third try. So let's see what you got.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
You ever walk into a room and just have no idea why you're in that room? There's the refrigerator, there's the washer dryer. Why am I here? So that just happened to me. On these reviews, however, whether they're ongoing reviews, periodic reviews, if we need to make changes to that and we decide to go down this omnibus road, would we need to reopen the entire omnibus every time we wanted to make a change, or would it be compartmentalized where we can open, you know, parts of it for individual fishery management plans? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, so on the cover page of an omnibus, it notes all the FMPs that it is individually amending. So you would not have to, if later you wanted to update the squid, mackerel, butterfish plan, you could then in the future, if that's the only one that needed a change in the future, you could then just do an action to amend, you know, that plan, or, you know, do a framework. Some of these things, some of these EFH items are also in the list of frameworkable items, you know, if it's within the scope of what's been previously contemplated. So there may be some capability with using some of the frameworks, which is an expedited process. But typically with a big omnibus like that, and if there's a lot of changes all happening at the same time, we don't use the framework tool for that.
Okay, thanks for that. Anyone else at the table with any questions? I'm going to go to the audience for questions at this time. I have Mike Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Jessica, thanks for the detailed presentation. Always good to hear your voice. I had a question about the fishing effects model. I assume the output of that is kind of self-explanatory, fishing effects on habitat. But my question is any of that linked back to the population dynamics?
The fishing effects model is not. It's more oriented towards the habitat conditions, you know, the bottom habitat itself. So there's a lot of habitat data that's in there. And then it pulls in a lot of information on the distribution of fishing efforts. So there's an effort component to it. And also what the individual expected impacts from those different gear types are on the habitat itself. So it is not it is not in any way integrated with any of the biological models. And if you're interested, I can send you a link. There's a really great summary of the fishing effects model on the New England website on their habitat page. So I can send that along to you if you'd like more detail.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully it's not the 127-page document I'm currently looking at.
All right, thanks, Mike. Anyone else from the public? Anyone in the room want to make any, have any questions? I don't see any hands, so I'm going to come back to the council and ask what the pleasure of the council is regarding the suggestion from Jessica regarding an omnibus amendment issue. There is a draft motion that we could put up if anyone is willing to make that motion. We can debate it. Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be willing to make that draft motion if we can on the screen. Great, thank you. So I move to initiate an omnibus essential fish habitat amendment to address the components of an EFH review and concurrently revise the fishery management plans as needed.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I ask for a second? Would anyone like to second this motion?
Second, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. I don't know who said that. I was looking at, okay. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we now have a motion to debate. I think I'm trying to remember back to yesterday. We'll make this the property of the council at this point, and I'll ask for discussion on the motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Peter?
Step 2. Step 3. Tell you, I mean, omnibus amendments are pretty intimidating. And I don't necessarily know that I can really support this motion at this time because this is kind of the first time I'm hearing about this. Omnibus is such an all-encompassing action. Right now, without additional information, and maybe it's my fault and I need to go home and do a bunch of homework on this, I just don't know that I could support this today. Because really, this is the first crack I'm having at kind of rationalize this and wrap my head around this. So that's where my position would be right now. Right now. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Peter. I'm going to go to Jessica, and then I have a comment.
So I guess I'm a little less afraid of omnibuses because I have done one of these before. Back in 2010 and 2011, we had the annual catch limit and accountability measure Omnibus Amendment that we came off of the 2007 Magnuson reauthorization. And at the time, I think it was Gene Cray was our vice chair at the time, and Gene had told me that he thought I should name my firstborn child Omnibus. And then I had someone tell me I should get a tattoo Omnibus after it was done. It was a tremendous amount of work, but we did move that action in about a year and a half. But there again, in that case, there was a lot of front loading with consideration of the guidance and different approaches. And then we initiated the amendment and were able to move through that rather quickly. So I guess I'm just saying, Peter, you may be afraid of it. Maybe I should be afraid of it. Maybe I'm silly to not be afraid of it. But I feel like it is something that we can move through efficiently. But like I said, it's going to be working with the science we have, I think being reasonable, not running down sort of rabbit holes for data that we don't have, working with we have and trying to be very efficient in how we apply that. And we've got a great team. We'll have a fishery management action team working on that. We've got really great folks that do really great work. So I just wanted to make that comment. But no, I don't have an omnibus tattoo, just so you know. Didn't follow up on that one.
That's probably a good thing. Yeah, so the way I think about it too is, this is the initiation of an action, so that Peter doesn't have to go home and do his homework. Somebody else can do the homework and provide information for the council to consider down the road. That's, this is just the start of a process. And I certainly support that. I've got a few hands at this time. I'm going to go to Michelle, and then Wes, and then Adam. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm not afraid of the omnibus process either. And I think especially because, Jessica reviewed, I think, all of the advances in information that have occurred over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I think, we're looking at a process that's probably going to be much more efficient. And I do think these updates are needed, just given all of the different ocean uses that are going on right now. I think it's really important that we have the most current information, and with the with the completion of the Habitat Explorer, I think that's a really valuable tool that will play into this, as well as I think all of the work that Jessica did and others, but with respect to the CCC conversations on marine uses and I don't want to say protected areas, but the work that went into supporting the CCC's letter with respect to conservation areas and in light of the administration's emphasis on that. So I'm not afraid of this. I think it needs to be done. And I think that we have a great team to get us there in an efficient manner. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Wes Townsend?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we don't pass this, is the work actually even going to stop, or it's still going to continue anyway, correct? If we don't pass this?
You mean the habitat work to,
Yes.
on NERA and the tools? Yes, that work would continue.
Okay, thanks, Wes. Adam Nowalski?
As a follow-up to our vice chair's question and the conversation yesterday at the executive committee for the 2023 implementation plan, what do we think would be the top candidates to come out of the possible additions that we would discuss in December for the full council for the implementation plan if we didn't initiate this amendment here today, given that there was a specific line item in the draft implementation plan for the amendment?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just straightforward response, Adam, would be up to the council. So we don't prioritize any of those things that are in that possible additions list. So if in fact, get to December, decide to initiate this amendment today, have that conversation. Say, basically, council, which one of these things is one? See.
All right, thanks, Chris. Mike Pentney. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't understand why the council wouldn't initiate this action. Presumably, you know, as Jessica described, you know, the agency, we're doing EFH consultations on many projects up and down the coast. We talked about the development of wind. There's a lot of port infrastructure activities happening in support of wind, as well as all of the typical traditional activities up and down the coast that prompt EFH consultations. Presumably, the council wants the agency to be using the most, you know, current, up-to-date, best science in terms of those EFH designations when we do those consultations. And the only way for us to be doing that is for this amendment to move forward and update the EFH designation so that we can rely on those in our consultation work. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mike. I'm going to ask again if there's anyone around the table on the council. I've heard mostly positive support for this action and a slight negative, well, maybe just concern about moving forward. So is there anyone else that has any concerns that they have? We've heard a number of positive comments, but before I go to the public. Okay, Dan Farnham. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. I couldn't find my hand button. I'm a little confused. What do we gain by doing this action, addressing or looking at all the FMPs at one time, as compared to doing a review on each individual FMP? What do we gain by doing it all at once? Thank you.
I mean, I think it comes down to some level of efficiency, but I'll return to Jessica to see if she has any thoughts.
Yes, so it is a matter of efficiency. If you try to address all the FMPs independently, then you need to be moving an action, an amendment, a framework through the process and then through the rulemaking process independently. So you'd have to have a separate action for each of those plans as you do those. Many of our plans, because you're required to do these reviews every 5 years under Magnuson, many of them are outdated. So by doing these as an omnibus, it's an opportunity to bring them all up to sort of compliance with Magnuson in terms of that 5-year review requirement sort of efficiently. But it's moving one action, one set of meetings, the similar council meetings, committee meetings, AP meetings as needed to move this through the process. There's a lot of activity involved with any individual action. So you'd be multiplying that by what, 7? If you tried to move these independently, or 7, 8. How many do we have? 7 plans? 8, I don't know.
If you don't know, there's no doubt that I'm going to be able to come up with the right answer. But okay, let's see if there's anyone else at the council. All right, let's go out to the public. Is there anyone in the room that would like to provide comment? Kate?
Good morning, everyone. I'll introduce myself now as a member of the public. Kate Wilkie, fishery scientist with the Nature Conservancy. I want to speak today in support of this action. Yes, an omnibus is a huge amount of work, and Jessica just spoke to the efficiencies that would be gained in doing it through that mechanism. But I also wanted to mention that it won't be starting from scratch. I was a member of I am a member of the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment Project Steering Committee. And that's been going on for 2 or 3 years. And there's a ton of really awesome science describing these habitats that came out of that process. So that can readily inform the EFH review process. And it only makes sense to use that science and now take the next step and put it into some sort of policy where we can actually use it to inform our management. And Tori led a lot of that work and was really integral to the process, and she's now here on the council staff, so that's really excellent. I think just the last thought is all this talk about species distribution changes that we talk about all the time. I mean, that's really habitat changing. So it makes sense to really use the most current information possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Nice to see you. Jason Didden.
Hey there. Having gone through a FMP specific update of some EFH designations, I think not just efficiency, but also gathering the level of expertise if you break it up into a bunch of different actions, I think it may be very hard to replicate the level of expertise that will be available for an omnibus. When we did it specific to MSB last time, we definitely didn't have the amount of expertise that I see working on the EFH stuff now. So I think not just efficiency, I think is important to consider. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. Anyone else from the public with any comment regarding the motion? Okay, seeing no hands, I'm going to bring it back to the table. Are there any additional last thoughts regarding the motion? Okay, I'm going to read the motion into the record and then call the question. Move to initiate an omnibus essential fish habitat amendment to address the components of an EFH review and concurrently revise the fishery management plans as needed. Is there any objection to the motion at this time? Seeing no objection, the motion carries with unanimous consent. Jessica, is there anything else you wanted to bring up under this topic this morning?
No, that would close out this issue. I'll just note that now that you've initiated an amendment, we'll be sending out letters to form a fishery management action team and get that compiled, and then hopefully start work in early 2023.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. Based on the comments and that I made early, let's take a 5-minute break and come back at 10 o'clock. As I mentioned, I'm going to step out, and Wes is going to take the reins. Should be home in a few hours, and I'm going to listen into the afternoon session. But it's easier for someone in the room to chair the meeting. So I appreciate your, you realize there's certain, you got to do what you got to do. And I would want to be here a million times over, but you got to do what you got to do. So let's take a 7-minute break. We'll come back at 10 o'clock and pick up with the next item on the agenda. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, if we get started at 10:05, will you be ready? Are you on the line now, ready?
Sir, I'm ready.
All right, we'll start at 10:05. 3-minute warning, everybody. All right, everyone, welcome back to the meeting. We are now going to be getting a report from Dr. Mike Osorio, Protected Resource Staff from NOAA Fisheries. He's going to be discuss the roadmap and provide input on the Ropeless roadmap report. So Mike, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. My name is Mike Asaro, and I'm an economist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about the a document described here, the draft Ropeless roadmap, which we're calling the strategy to develop on-demand fishing. And I'd like to walk you through the contents of the report, invite you to review it yourselves, and ask you for your feedback and input on the document and the contents described within it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Give me just a second. I'm trying to figure out why it's not advancing on the webinar. All right, you should be good to go now.
Great, thank you. So just an overview here of what I'd like to cover this morning. I'll start with a review of the Ropeless roadmap itself. We'll talk about why the roadmap's needed, and what its purpose is. We'll walk through briefly the contents of the document, including on-demand gear testing that's been ongoing, and discuss scenarios for increased adoption of on-demand gear, where right whale entanglement risk reduction is needed most over time. And we'll touch upon the regulatory changes that are needed to enable more broad-scale use of ropeless gear beyond the experimentation phase that we're currently in. And lastly, I'll discuss our plan for soliciting feedback from stakeholders involved in this process, including members of the public, and I'll invite your feedback as well. And next slide, please. But before I go into the document itself, I would like to just cover a few key points up front. The first is that in drafting this document, we have laid out one possible path forward based on the current state of the technology, the current level of testing and experimentation that we've been involved in at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. But we acknowledge that there are many ways that this situation can progress. It's highly complex, and we know that the technology is developing, and we know that the regulations are developing too, and the need for risk reduction to protect right whales from lethal entanglements is also developing at a rapid pace. So we want to clarify that up front to show that we have laid out here one possible path forward, but we know that that will be guided by input from you all and from other stakeholders in this process so that we can refine our approach over time. That's why we're presenting to you a draft today and asking for feedback, and we can discuss towards the end of the talk plans for refining this approach over time. And as part of that, I can't emphasize enough that input and guidance from everyone involved, from fisheries managers to researchers to fishermen, industry representatives, gear engineers, and many more. The input from all of those groups and individuals is and will be critical for this effort to progress in an effective and efficient way. And part of our effort here in this document is to solicit feedback and try to organize the gathering of input from all the stakeholders so that we can produce an efficient plan and an effective plan moving forward. And then lastly, one thing this document doesn't lay out is a vision for the adoption of on-demand gear for everyone all the time. It's clear that there are areas of especially high entanglement risk along the East Coast. We know that from the work that the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team is currently undertaking, looking at areas of the highest concentration of fishing gear, right whale sightings, and anticipated movement based on ecosystem changes we've seen in the past few years especially, and also looking at different gear configurations, acknowledging that there are places where gear that is especially harmful to right whales is fished, and all of those factors combined produce areas of especially high entanglement risk that we believe ought to be the focus of on-demand testing and adoption sooner. And there are other places where, let's say, inshore gear is fished with a relative low occurrence of right whales, perhaps, and where vertical lines are thin and perhaps less lethal to whales, where it might be less of a candidate now for conversion to on-demand gear. However, I will say that there's testing underway in all those gear types and all those configurations, and each of them shows promise in different ways. But we want to underscore that we don't envision a wholesale conversion of the entire fixed gear fisheries on the East Coast to on-demand gear at any point in the near future. Instead, we look at how this process will develop over time so that in the end, as quickly as we can produce technologically feasible, operationally feasible, and cost-effective on-demand solutions for those fisheries where it's needed and for those fishermen who choose to fish it. Next slide, please. So why a ropeless roadmap? Simply put, this document is one of many efforts currently underway to respond to the urgent conservation crisis facing North Atlantic right whales. The situation with right whales, as I'm sure you know and have been briefed in the past, is bad and appears to be growing worse, to the point where extinction risk within our lifetimes is a very real possibility. We know that under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the take reduction team is currently working to recommend to the agency measures to achieve a 90% risk reduction coast-wide in all fixed gear fisheries in response to this crisis. And we feel it necessary to provide a vision for on-demand gear into the future. We know that on-demand gear is just one tool that's currently being looked at, and there are certain instances where it seems to make sense, and there are others where it doesn't, based on where we are in the development and the production of the gear and the cost, et cetera. And all of these things need to be considered and presented to decision makers who are currently thinking through ways to reduce entanglement risk along the coast. And we also hope to align partners in this thinking so we can coordinate the perspective of all involved and initiate a conversation here and elsewhere so that folks can be on the same page, looking at the same available information, understanding the current state of the testing, and working with our best understanding of how we think this technology will progress over time. To that end, the purpose of the roadmap is to begin this conversation. It's not the entire conversation. We hope to use the material that's presented here to stimulate discussion, and we solicit feedback through traditional means or by using the QR code or address on the screen to submit feedback directly on our input form that's tied to the roadmap itself. And we'd also like to clarify what roles the marine mammal managers have, what other fisheries managers have, and what stakeholders and industry, et cetera, play in managing how this process moves forward. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick overview of the document itself, which again, I invite you to review. And I'll walk through this in a little bit more detail in a bit. But we talk about what is on-demand gear. We discuss the current state of the technology, how available is the gear, how is the testing currently underway, who's involved in the testing, where is it occurring, and how do fishermen get involved in the testing that's been happening. For example, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center has a ropeless gear lending library that currently has nearly 200 ropeless units that are being loaned out to fishermen so that the fishermen can experience the gear themselves, see how it works, provide feedback back to researchers and to the engineers who are designing the gear so that it can be refined over time. And we look at using the ropeless gear currently. What are the current regulatory requirements in place that enable or prohibit ropeless gear up and down the coast? And then we look forward at the various states of development from where we are today with technological development testing, where we might hope to be in resolving gear conflict, and in the future expanding experimental fishing, and lastly looking at FMP and take reduction plan regulatory change to enable more broad scale experimental fishing and adoption of ropeless gear for those who'd like to use it. We review where is on-demand fishing gear needed, highlighting that under the take reduction plan right now, there are currently restricted areas throughout up and down the coast in certain times of the year where the density of right whales is especially high. And we offer that areas that are currently closed to gillnets and other trap pod fisheries now probably provide the best opportunity or incentive for fishermen to test ropeless gear if they're allowed back into areas that they'd otherwise be closed out of. And then lastly, we talk about geolocation options. In small-scale ropeless testing, it's relatively easy to avoid gear conflicts. But as we know, as on-demand gear is or will be deployed at a wider scale with fishermen close to each other and in the presence of mobile fisheries as well, the risk of gear conflict will be extremely high. So effective, efficient, and low-cost geolocation technological solutions need to be developed and available to all in order to minimize the risk of gear conflicts as on-demand gear deployment scales up. Next slide, please. So here is just a graphic that highlights 3 focal areas in on-demand development. It's at its most simply, it's the retrieval of a trap or a net on the ocean floor without a vertical buoy. So the recovery aspect of it, whether it's from an acoustic release or a timed release, research and testing has been underway for quite a while to show that that is effective and can be done through a variety of ways, whether it's through grappling or a pop-up buoy, an inflatable lift bag, a buoyant spool. All of these technologies exist and are being used in testing today and are showing high levels of feasibility. Once fishermen are able to get the gear and overcome the initial learning curve, we've been getting broad-scale positive feedback on the use of ropeless gear retrieval systems themselves. As I mentioned, the geolocation is a key part of it. This is something that is occurring at a slight lag behind the recovery testing itself. And we know that there are software solutions out there, like those from a company called Earth Ranger, et cetera, that show on an app like the one that exists now. It's called the Trap Tracker app. You know, where your gear is located relative to other deployed on-demand gear. We know that the technology is there today to allow for low-cost, effective geolocation solutions, but clearly a lot of work needs to be done in this area before it can be deployed at a wide scale. And the last is the regulations. Now, there are current regulations, whether it's to protect marine mammals like right whales under the Take Reduction Plan and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or fisheries management regulations in place that currently direct where, when, and how ropeless gear can be deployed. You know, right now a surface buoy is required for fixed gear fisheries under their fishery management plans, and for ropeless testing, right now an exempted fishing permit or state equivalence needed for those who wish to gain access to a marine mammal protection closure area, for example. So that's the current regulatory framework, and we need to envision how that might change over time once we move past the small scale testing that's currently being done and progress towards something like a broader scale experimental fishery. Next slide, please. So I'll just walk through the 4 steps that we've outlined in the roadmap one by one here. And again, for more detail, please, I invite you to review the document yourself as well. Next slide, please. So this figure is the Northeast Fisheries Science Center's gear research diagram that we apply to a wide variety of bycatch mitigation solutions, whether it's to protect sea turtles and turtle excluder devices, or for testing pingers, for harbor porpoise bycatch mitigation and gill nets and so forth. So we've been using this existing gear research development cycle approach and how we engage with fishermen and the on-demand gear manufacturers to get gear in the hands of those who'd like to test it and get feedback back to the researchers and engineers to refine the technology over time. And that's really where we are, today in 2022. We're optimistic about the progress. I believe my colleagues Henry Milliken and Eric Mattson have presented to you all in the past, giving an overview of the more detailed description of the state of their testing in a partnership with fishermen who have been partnered up and down the coast, inshore and offshore, testing gear from the Science Center's lending library. And today that work is largely being done, as I mentioned, under federal exempted fishing permits or state letters of authorization or other equivalents. And given where we are in the challenge to reduce lethal entanglement risk to right whales, there's a clear need to accelerate this process. And it has. I think most of us are surprised just how much progress has been made in the 4 seasons or so that this work has been underway, in collaboration through the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. But clearly there's a need to bridge the gap, so to speak, to progress the technology to the point that it is fully operational and available and cost effective, and can meet the need of the risk reduction requirements that the take reduction team are working towards under the Marine Mammal Protection Act today. The next slide, please. So again, there's a lot of geolocation software development and testing that's currently underway. The Science Center alone has the Earth Ranger geolocation software applied to every on-demand gear manufacturer that's currently has gear in the lending library, and we have a sampling of basically every system available. We're testing the feasibility of surface mark positions and basically using acoustics to increase the precision of being able to identify the location of gear on the seafloor. One thing that's clear to us, and we have heard from industry as well, and on-demand gear manufacturers for that matter, is however the geolocation technology develops so that we can maximize our ability to fish without gear conflict. What will be key is for open source, open standard, non-proprietary, interoperable, however you want to describe it, geolocation solutions. An outcome that we need to prevent, and I think we're working towards this, is having certain manufacturers produce their own unique proprietary non-interoperable geolocation solution, therefore requiring fishermen to buy several different units in order to effectively prevent gear conflict and see the location of others' gear. We know that's not going to work, and we've heard that loud and clear from stakeholders already, and it certainly stands to reason. So I think there's good progress there on interoperable technologies, and clearly there's we're encouraged by the progress, but there's quite a ways to go. But in the meantime, we've already heard the take reduction team just last month kick around ideas of having one end ropeless, one end buoyed as a way to reduce vertical lines overall and meet risk reduction targets. So there are clearly interim measures that can be used and deployed in the fisheries, I think today, that can help work towards refining both the on-demand gear and the geolocation solutions that are currently being developed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, most of the work in federal waters is being done under exempted fishing permits so fishermen are able to deploy their gear without a surface buoy. And we approach this acknowledging that these regulations are in place and exemptions would be required in order to deploy the gear, and to an extent that's been okay. But it's clear that as the demand for access to the gear, whether it's through the center's lending library or fishermen wanting to purchase their own gear, whatever it may be, we've seen a much greater increase in demand for fishermen wanting to test the gear along the entire coast than we had anticipated. So it's relatively easy to foresee a situation where using EFPs to authorize all this gear is no longer the best option, and some other system will be needed in order to enable this testing and experimentation to happen. So that's where I think fisheries managers ought to be thinking about now to be prepared for, to meet the needs of the demand for on-demand gear and fishermen who'd like to test the gear and use it without having to rely on either existing or new EFPs in order to be able to fish while meeting all of the current regulations. And again, this has been especially important as areas that are currently restricted under the take reduction plan to protect whales are in place now, and to the extent that they might be expanded or new ones may be added in the future, using EFPs to access areas that would otherwise be closed to buoyed gear is the demand is there now. It's sure to increase, and I believe it's a good incentive to develop on-demand gear by allowing fishermen who would otherwise be restricted from an area to gain access through the use of this technology. Next slide, please. And beyond that, thinking through where we are today with relatively small scale testing, envisioning a future where we have a larger full-fledged experimental fishery, and beyond, where we have a combination of buoyed and on-demand gear fishing at broad scales within the same areas to meet the risk reduction needs, perhaps under the take reduction plan, and so forth. It's clear that the current regulations we have in place will quickly reach their capacity, and FMPs and the take reduction plan will need to be rewritten in a way that can accommodate a future where we have more broad scale use of both buoyed and on-demand gear fishing in the same areas at the same times. Next slide, please. So here is a figure that just shows the areas that are currently restricted under the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan for all fixed gear fisheries at certain times of the year, based on when the occurrence of right whales is so high that the fishing of any vertical lines within these areas would pose an unacceptable risk. And clearly, there are quite a few of these areas that are already in place now. The Take Reduction Plan amendments a year ago, that were put in place a year ago, added the South Islands restricted area and increased the Massachusetts restricted area northward, up around Cape Ann to the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border, and added the LMA1 restricted area off the coast of Maine as well, on the LMA1, LMA3 boundary. And we know that the take reduction team has currently been meeting, and to achieve the 90% risk reduction, there have been a number of scenarios or packages of measures that have been analyzed to achieve the 90% that include increased, whether it's new restricted areas or increased either the time or the timing or the size of currently restricted areas. So it's we can envision a future where the entanglement risk of right whales is in certain areas at certain times of the year is unacceptably high under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, such that more restricted areas are needed in order to meet the requirements under the law. And in that case, we already know today that on-demand gear, incentivizing the use of and development of on-demand gear by allowing fishermen access to these otherwise restricted areas is a popular, certainly popular now, and it's likely to grow in the future. And I think we need to be ready on the gear side and on the regulatory side to accommodate that increase in demand, both now and into the future. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, this roadmap is a draft document. It's something that we're going to view it as a living document. We are spending the rest of this calendar year presenting what's in it and asking for feedback, and from a variety of groups in a variety of ways. And I certainly invite your feedback as well. And we acknowledge that on-demand fishing is clearly viable today in some limited applications. However, we know that the technology needs further development. Most of the on-demand gear that's in use today is still in prototype form. We haven't even reached the point where these units are in finalized form and have entered mass production to the point where costs have been reduced so that they're cost effective for widespread adoption by fishermen who'd like to use it. Current cost for units is around $4,000, with an additional $1,500 for the deck unit. So we know that is not cost effective today. And in fact, the primary way that fishermen are gaining access to using on-demand gear is for free through the center's lending library. We support that approach and think it's the best way to get this gear in the hands of those fishermen who'd like to use it. But it inherently acknowledges that the gear is too expensive for fishermen who'd like to use it to go out and buy it themselves at $4,000 a unit. So we know that we need to refine the technology, allow the manufacturers to move it into mass production quickly, and bring it to the point where the fishermen have decided that it's a cost-effective solution for them. And we know we're a long ways away from that. But we know that in principle, the technology works. We know that as fishermen, even those who may be skeptical, once they are able to get on the water and testing the gear, we've gotten lots of positive feedback after that, and that is really encouraging. We know that more experimentation, more testing is needed, and we invite as many fishermen who have any interest in partnering with the Science Center through the gear lending library to gain access to fishing this gear for yourself. We think that's a critical part to whether this effort achieves success, both for commercial success for the fisheries and also risk reduction for right whales as well. And we know that stakeholder support is critical to success. This is not something that can be pursued or developed by one group alone. We know there needs to be cooperation, and there has been. And we know that this is critical for the long-term success of the development and the adoption of a technology like this. Our next steps are to continue to present the roadmap, share it as widely as we can, and we've been inviting feedback from a variety of groups, including the fishery management councils and take reduction team, etc. Be presenting at the Right Whale Consortium later this month as well, trying to get as much exposure as we can, and more importantly, to solicit as much feedback as we can from those who have an interest in the development of this technology. Our plan is to keep soliciting feedback through the rest of the calendar year, and in early 2023, we will undergo an effort to incorporate all of the feedback we received, revise the document, share it again, and we intend this to be an iterative process that goes from the document as it's written today, which in some key areas is in need of more specificity. And our intent over time is, with your help and with the help of others involved here, to refine this roadmap, add in more specificity as the landscape becomes more clear, as we conduct more research, more experimentation, as more is known about right whale risk reduction plans for the future. Again, this is something that's happening in parallel to an accelerated take reduction plan process that is evolving very quickly. So we like to accommodate some time for the take reduction team to make its final recommendations for rulemaking to the agency, and we hope to continue this process and refine it early in 2023. And again, with your help and engagement and input too, which is critically important. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think it's very interesting, the work that is being done. We have one council member now that's currently in testing with you guys, Sunny Gwynn. And if things go down the road, I'm a commercial pot fisherman, so I may have to be doing this someday. So very interesting. Is there any questions for Mike? Matt, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and Mike, I appreciate the presentation. One of the questions that I get on this side, I'm from the Coast Guard, is it with the ropeless gear, how do we enforce this? So I guess I was trying to get a sense from listening to the presentation, is how you see the enforcement of the ropeless gear as it transitions. Do you think there's going to be requirements for the pop-up buoys or the inflatable life bags, or I guess kind of what you see as the enforcement as we transition to this type of gear?
That's a great question, and thank you. And it's an important one. It's among the most important aspects of this that I think we can think of, especially as we try to think through what it means to scale up. And I don't have any clear answers on that today, but it's clear that it's something that needs to be overcome. We need to have clear methods for enforcement to be able to see the gear through geolocation, have access to the gear for assessment of compliance, etc. It's an important one, and it's a difficult one, and it's one that I don't have an answer for you today, other than to flag that as this develops over time, that's going to be a critical area where additional focus and attention is needed. So I would certainly invite feedback from those who are experts in areas of enforcement and work on this on a daily basis. Not necessarily to solicit solutions, but highlighting areas where we need additional focus and highlighting areas where major problems exist that we need to overcome in order for this to be successful. I mean, that's critical feedback too, in enforcement, in how we enforce broad scale adoption or deployment of on-demand gear. I think that's among the most important.
All right, thank you.
Sonny Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It was definitely helpful. And yes, I am doing some gear research or with these pop-up buoys, and so far I haven't did a lot of it. I think I pulled it 3 times. The last time we pulled it from deployment to the pop-up was 6 seconds, so I was pretty impressed with it. Now, my biggest concern is the cost on rigging up a whole stand of pots. I think that's one of the big questions we have to answer. And right now, it's free, which is really helpful. Another thing I did some years back was I got a grant to do a grappling where I grappled up my gear, and that seemed to work pretty good if you had to do it. Would that be one of the options? Because the price of that would be like almost nothing.
That's a great question too, and thank you for that feedback. To me, I think I've heard different opinions on whether grappling should be included in the definition of on-demand gear for a variety of, I suppose, concerns and reasons. From my perspective, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, and for 2 reasons. One is cost, right? We know fishermen already have a grapple anyway, and are already experienced in grappling up gear for any number of reasons, and we know it's low cost compared to the other solutions you mentioned. So I don't, in my mind, I include grappling in my definition of on-demand gear, but I do know that opinions vary on that. But from my perspective, I see no difference.
Yeah, follow up. Yeah, in certain areas in the Mid-Atlantic, and I've stated this many times, the effort is so low that it is feasible at certain times when, say, the whales are coming back and forth, and we'd have to do it. I understand that. But the effort is so low that there isn't very many gear conflicts. We fish in areas where the draggers don't drag. So it would be it could be an option if we had to do it. I just thought I'd put that out there. And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Sonny. Skip Feller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I basically had a comment. I know it was a few years ago, it was either 2 or 3 years ago, we had a dead right whale off of our coast that we went out and had it towed in. They towed it into Sandbridge Beach to do an necropsy on it, and it was tangled up in gear, and it actually still had the tag on the gear, and it was Canadian gear. And then I know more recently, as of just a week or so ago, there is a very famous right whale that's tangled up right now, snow cone, and she was seen south of Nantucket, but she also, they're assuming it's Canadian gear. The last time she was seen was in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I know a huge amount, I know early on they're seen in Nantucket and, inside the Cape and everything. And then as the summer goes on, it seems like their feeding has shifted the last few years to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that's where a huge amount of them are. Is anything being done with the Canadian gear? So that's 2 whales right there that are entangled, but it's Canadian gear. And, if I agree that we need to do what we need to do here, but if they're still allowed to do what they do, it seems like there needs to be a collaboration with them to try to get something done, because that's 2 whales in Canadian gear that basically, our fishermen are probably getting blamed on.
That's a great point. I don't want to speak too much for the Canadians, but I will say that there is a partnership in place between NOAA and DFO to meet and to share, what we've learned from doing this in our country for 20 years already, versus the Canadian effort that's only been really going for 4 or 5 years now. The Canadian approach, just from my observation here, they rely a lot on dynamic management, and they've really ramped that up in the past few years. A few reasons why they're able to do that is that they have a summer seasonal fishery right there in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for snow crab, and a relatively small geographic location, in which everyone's fishing. So it's easy and cost effective for them to fly planes over it to be able to implement closures as right whales are seen. And you're right, since 2015, 2016, 2017, there's been a huge increase in the number of right whales that travel from the Gulf of Maine to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to forage in the summertime. And at this point, we've been able to capture photo ID of pretty much all the whales that visit the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And out of the 350 right whales that remain, it seems to be about the same 130 or 140 that go up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence for the months of June, July, August, and into September before they come back into the Gulf of Maine right around now, in fact. So, we know, yes, right whales are using the Gulf of Maine as a forage location a lot more in recent years. There was a shift in their distribution pattern that it seems to have settled for the time being. It's impossible to predict, when and if it'll shift again. But, while those 130 or so right whales are in the Gulf of Maine, all the rest are still in the U.S. and they're not in any one place. They're dispersed all the way up and down the coast. We've been surprised by feeding aggregations off of Virginia Beach, for example. But there was a right whale in the Bay of Fundy just a few weeks ago, and researchers had thought that right whales were no longer using the Bay of Fundy, this time of year. So, it's hard to predict. There are certainly areas and times of the years where we know we can count on them aggregating. Cape Cod Bay in the springtime, the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the summertime for a portion of the whales. But the rest are just dispersed throughout, and that's pretty much how they've always been. If it's that right whale that was entangled and towed to Virginia Beach that you're thinking of a few years ago, one thing we don't do is attribute the location where the right whale was seen dead or first seen dead we don't assume that the entanglement happened there. So nobody, fishermen off of Virginia weren't held accountable for that whale. That was clearly Canadian gear and was treated as such. But at the end of the day, we only see about 2 or 3, if we're lucky, dead right whales a year. And we know that upwards of 30 and 40 are dying a year from both ship strikes and entanglements, but it seems to be more entanglements than ship strikes at this point. So we don't know where it's almost impossible for us to attribute back to a specific location in the fishery the source of almost any of the entanglements. Because as you mentioned, when right whales pick up gear, they move. They are hardly ever anchored in place when they become entangled. So it makes it really impossible to trace back unless the gear is especially unique, something like Canadian snow crab, where once you get it, it's really, really easy to ID and attribute to that specific fishery for a variety of reasons. But being able to collect gear, first of all, being able to even see the dead whales is extremely rare. But once you do, being able to get gear and then being able to use that gear to trace it back to a specific geographic location and fishery is at this point almost impossible. As much as I regret having to say that, but that's the reality that we're dealing with.
Peter Hughes.
Very much, Acting Chairman. My question goes back to earlier councilman's thoughts on cost of this gear. I think that you had mentioned that it was $4,000 for the on-demand transponder to release the buoy float, bags and a floating spool. And that the other cost was $1,500 for the component that would be up in the wheelhouse of the boat to do. Working with your fishermen, how many pots are they able to utilize with one of the on-demand fishing transponders? I mean, what are they currently fishing 10 pots per string, 50 pots per string? And do you expect that $4,000, which is very expensive in my mind, to come down over the course of time?
Yes, so we have fishermen partnered with us that are fishing, singles inshore, and we have fishermen, on the shelf edge of Georges Bank and LMA3 with 40 pot trawls. And what we've seen is it's possible to swap in these on-demand units in your current fishing configuration and still be able to fish effectively. So the release mechanism still works, at any depth where any East Coast U.S. fisherman would be fishing. It sends a reliable signal. The buoy pops up and then can be used to haul gear, regardless of the size of your end line or the length of your trawl. It'll be effective no matter what the configuration is. And it's being tested in a variety of conditions right now and has been for quite a while. And on cost, you're absolutely right. So the units that are being tested today are prototypes. And some are being manufactured by hand by certain, some of the companies. And the purpose of the testing now is to get feedback from the fishermen to the engineers in these companies to refine their units. And it doesn't take long once fishermen get them on the water to say, this worked, this aspect of it worked. I had feedback to improve, X, Y, and Z. That's really the best we can ask for at this point, and it's been highly effective. So once the units themselves, the on-demand units, the design and the function aspects can be locked in, we can get to the point where the companies can mass produce these things, which I would anticipate a substantial reduction in cost. $4,000 per end line replacement with a $1,500 deck box is not cost effective for anybody, right? That's clear. That's a no-brainer. No fisherman can support the conversion of their gear at that cost and still maintain a profitable business. So I don't think that's what we're talking about today. We're trying to get to the point where we can get the testing done in as many conditions, with as many gear configurations, with as many different on-demand manufacturers, so that they can move their products to mass production, lower the costs, and produce a economically feasible, operationally feasible product that fishermen can use as one tool to reduce their number of end lines, should that be required under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, at any point in the future rulemaking. I think that's really what the state of the landscape is today. But yes, the current cost of these prototypes is not cost effective whatsoever. But I do think that's going to change, and it's going to change in the near future, I believe.
Thank you for that. I have life expectancy questions on units also, and how often you anticipate vessels are going to need to replace that technology. My other question is, and I've asked this in the past in various other meetings that I've attended, is how are bottom trawling boats, how are scallop dredges, how are clam dredges going to know that gear is in the area? Plus a multitude of other vessels. So there are, reduced gear conflicts, very, very low percentage of gear conflicts. I mean, what's the technology for the boats, the other boats that are out there fishing, so that they don't incidentally tear up somebody's gear, expensive gear?
Exactly. Yep. So that's a question that's a central question of this roadmap, and it's one where we're calling attention to folks who have the the ability to solve this problem, because it is a big one. You know, as scaling up happens, we know that effective geolocation to prevent conflicts, or not prevent conflict, but at least make it make conflict as likely as it is now. Right? We're not. I think that's the standard we can strive to at this point. But it's clear that whatever geolocation solution is used for the fixed gear fisheries, it's something that will need to be included as a tool for mobile fishermen as well, so they can, you know, avoid dragging through areas where on-demand gear is set. So it's a two-pronged problem that requires solving. It's a geolocation option so that, you know, fixed gear fishermen know where each other's gear is, but also something that enables mobile fisheries to be able to avoid dragging through these areas as well. This is probably the most complex aspect of this entire thing, trying to envision how this works and how a geolocation solution works. You know, Earth Ranger is the company that's been working most closely with this. It's a group that's formed by the Paul Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. It's a nonprofit that works on developing these kind of solutions. They have an off-the-shelf product called Earth Ranger that seems to fit our needs, and you know they've agreed to develop a solution. You know, one of their off-the-shelf products, and basically, you know, give it, you know, as part of their philanthropy to help solve this problem. So the technology's there. There's interest from those who have the ability to help solve these problems, to work on this. You know, the geolocation options that currently exist have been deployed already and seem to be effective in small scales, but it's hard. It's certainly hard to be able to draw conclusions from small scale testing to envision a full intermixed on-demand and traditional fixed gear fishery with, you know, adjacent mobile gear. That's probably the biggest potential problem or roadblock that is going to require solutions to help overcome. You know, I don't have an answer today. All I can say is, you know, we're aware that that's probably the biggest hurdle towards broad, you know, scale deployment, and there's a lot of folks already paying attention to this. There are solutions that are under development and being tested, but it's clear that quite a bit of work needs to be done in this area alone if it's going to be effective.
Dewey Helmerich. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. Particularly to the price of the product, it's been my experience with the vessel monitoring system that 2005 and 6, I believe I paid for my first vessel monitoring system. That was $1,500. The second one I got, the government paid for at $3,100 or $3,300, and that lasted me about 7 years. And the recent one I just purchased this year in June was, I think I got a reduced discount of $300 in installation, so it was $3,400. And so I didn't see much of a drop in the price of something. And given that there's a limited amount of fishers and ever decreasing, I really wonder about how much of maybe it'd be the philanthropy and the NGO community that will do this stuff, nonprofits that will continue to donate in a decrease in market to cover the cost. I also have questions of wondering, this gear, salt water has a major impact on a lot of things. And what happens, what's the longest, like, well, I'm not even gonna ask the question because just waste or take up some more time, but I just wondering how long has the gear been deployed in the water for, you know, it's just starting new, like how about something, has anything been left out there for 6 months and went and retrieved it, or a year? And one follow-up asking is, given that we're doing all this technology for gear, is there any technology being dedicated to tagging the 350 right whales left? It seems the practicability part, that given that we're using all this work for the gear and the conundrums that we're going to have with various gear types and potentials and different things, is what type of technology
is the NGO or nonprofit community looking at to tag the right wells that can have an active monitoring system out there, given given the amount of blubber that they have? Is something being developed or looked at for tagging the right wells? Because it seems like, man, it'd be an awful lot easier to track the right well than it would be all this stuff that's going to happen to industry folks and their livelihoods, a continuation of all the industries, and you know, it would probably do a better effort of affecting and saving the right wells and interactions. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and feel free to interrupt if we're getting too far off topic. But I can speak a little bit about the tagging. You know, for marine mammals, there are basically two different types of tags that can be deployed. There's one that just rests under the surface of the skin. It's called limpet tag, and then there's a longer intramuscular tag that goes pretty deeply into the whale, through the skin, through the entire blubber layer, and connects with the muscle. The latter it's a pretty highly invasive tag, and it's one that we're pretty judicious about how we deploy it with a variety of whale species, and we tend to be most cautious with the rarest of whales. So I think, you know, right whales get the highest level of scrutiny in terms of, you know, how we would deploy a tag and what technology we'd use. In the past, limpet tags have been deployed on the skin of right whales. The trouble is they don't stay on very long. The right whales make a lot of contact with each other, and they tend to knock the tags right off after, you know, maybe 2 weeks at the most. But we can get information from that. There was a southern resident killer whale that, which is also endangered on the West Coast, that developed an infection after a tag was applied a few years ago and ended up dying, which caused some folks to pause and rethink approaches to tagging. But you're right. If we can get a tagging solution that will attach and be minimally invasive, then I think, you know, everyone who's paying attention to right whales would be on board and agrees with you that, you know, tagging will be able to give us a lot of information to help fill in the gaps about, you know, where right whales are at certain times of the year and help us protect them better. And I'll just add that there's a sister species, the southern right whale off the coast of South America, Argentina, which they look like our right whales and they behave like our right whales, but they are a different species, and they're much more abundant. They're not endangered. There are scientists from the U.S. down in Argentina right now testing out and developing, you know, new tags that sit a little bit deeper into the skin than the current limpet tags do and stay attached a lot longer. And in hopes that, you know, someday we can, in the near future, we'll be able to refine that new tagging technology, you know, bring it here and tag our, you know, North Atlantic right whales in what we hope is a minimally invasive way to help, you know, get more information to fill in these gaps about, you know, where the whales are at all times of the year.
Lieutenant Commander Matt Cayley.
Yeah, thank you. I had a follow-on question geared toward the timeline of when you think this will be kind of implemented throughout the FMPs.
I don't know exactly. And that's why, you know, the document itself stays pretty vague on the topic of timing. And I think the reason we did that here on this first draft is because of the uncertainty on the regulatory landscape. The one thing that I'm most focused on personally is the developments in the take reduction team that are happening right now. The team just finished a meeting last week, and they'll convene again around Thanksgiving next month to make progress on the development of recommendations that they're currently doing. And, you know, I think that after the conclusion of that next take reduction team meeting next month, I think we'll have a better sense of, you know, what the recommendations of the team are, and might have, you know, a clearer indication of what the folks who are working on Marine Mammal Protection Act implementation are thinking in terms of, you know, future rulemaking, you know, timing, and, you know, what that might involve in terms of risk reduction measures. So, you know, from my perspective and the perspective of this roadmap, it is, you know, vague on the topic of timing, and that's really to acknowledge the uncertainty here. But I do think that, you know, as we work on our end collecting feedback on the other aspects of this document from everyone involved, and work on refining what's in the document and trying to add specificity to some of these areas that have been left vague here in 2023. I do think that we'll get a clearer picture of when these on-demand solutions might be needed at a larger scale, and be able to compare that to where we are now in this current state of the development, to be able to highlight sort of that gap, and maybe come up with some possible ideas and solutions on how to bridge it to get from where the technology is today to where we might need to be for adoption in terms of any risk reduction needs coming up.
And Farnham?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question, maybe a follow-up comment. As far as the buoy, the unit that goes on the buoy below the surface of the water, how does it work? Is it battery operated, rechargeable or replaceable battery or one-time use? What are the particulars there? Thank you.
So the unit basically looks like a lobster trap cage, and all of the electronics are inside that unit, and including the acoustic receiver that gets the signal from the surface, and all of the electronics for the release mechanism that will open the door and let the buoy float up to the surface. And that's just one way the technology can work. There are others, like the buoyant spool, for example, or the lift bag that basically sinks an air compressor down to the ocean floor, and then when it retrieves the acoustic signal, inflates a lift bag. That's the technology has basically been adapted from the salvage industry to lift the entire trap cage to the surface, which then you can use the rope to haul after that. But so the technologies vary in terms of the mechanism to lift. The acoustic receiver is basically the same for all of them, and I think there's the question of batteries. I think there's variation in what types of batteries are used in all of the technologies. I don't know specifically offhand, but I think it's a combination of a replaceable or rechargeable, depending on the manufacturer and the specific unit. But it does vary now.
Yep, thank you. Just a comment from a mobile gear perspective, be it trolling or long lining. I mean, ideally, this sounds like it would be, from my point of view, it would be great if everything works the way it's supposed to work. I mean, I remember setting out long line gear, I'd spend more time looking out the windows looking for lobster pots than I would be looking at my plotter. Be able to look at your plotter and see all the gear right there, real time, and be able to work around it. It would be great if we could get to that point. That being said, I see every mobile gear vessel in the Northeast needing the unit on their boat, just to see where the bottom gear is. But not just that, not just the commercial boats. What about the recreational vessels? Be it they're out in the canyons anchoring up, or even inshore. I mean, they're going to want to know where the lobster gear is too, where the pot gear is, because nobody wants to anchor up and get caught up in a trawl. Just another thought. Thank you.
Chris Bat-Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Yeah, Dan had the same thought I was going to ask about. Was thinking about the need for certain aspects of the recreational fishery to have this geolocation technology. For bottom fishing, drifting, anchoring, things like that, where pot fishing occurs. Has there been any discussion of scaling that up for that fishery, or is the initial thoughts for where ropeless gear might be used in times and areas where the recreational fishery isn't operating? Thanks.
Great points. I don't think there have been, and I may be wrong, but I don't believe there have been recreational fishermen involved in the current geolocation testing. But I do think it's feasible to expand the use of the availability of whatever geolocation options are being used to, any, fishermen within a certain area. And there are limits that can be placed, for example. So, I know there's a lot of fishermen who have expressed concern about, who and what knows where their gear is and when, et cetera, and, how what steps can be taken to protect that information, or at least control how it's distributed. And the current trap tracker app, for example, that's being used, you can set a viewing neighborhood. So you need to be within a certain, GPS needs to locate you within a certain radius of the gear in order before it reveals to you where the location is, as a compromise so the folks who need to know where the gear is know, but there's the ability to limit, who knows. So there are some options there, and clearly this is, early days in terms of development. So as it progresses, as the technology is refined, and most importantly, as it scales up, there will be a need to bring in, additional enforcement aspects and recreational gear too, to make sure that it works.
Eric Reed. Vice Chair, I have two questions. One is about recoverability. I'd like to know how much of your gear is actually missing, never been recovered. And my second question is about liability when in gear conflicts. If a dragger tows up somebody's gear, who's liable? Can't see the gear, liable. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Good questions. I don't think I have an answer for the second one, but I acknowledge that is a very real concern, and that's something that'll have to be overcome. I can say in the 4 years so far that the Northeast Center's been testing gear, I don't believe there's been any lost gear. There have been, some complaints about certain aspects of the retrieval. A lot of it is related to the acoustic signal being sent from the vessel to the trap. I don't think there have been any, and I can double check on this for you with my colleagues who are running that program, but I don't believe there has been any gear loss. And there have been the success rate in terms of any aspect of either the deployment or the acoustic signal being sent or the gear coming to the surface and retrieval. The instances, or the number of hauls where all of those things go as planned with no failure whatsoever, or no hangups whatsoever. It's increased over time in the 4 years that we've been doing this, and it's in the high 90% range of perfect haul, so to speak, with no issues. And the one thing they've observed too in this testing is that gear that's been deployed with ropeless units tends to stay in place on the bottom a lot more than traditional gear would, with the surface buoy. And I mean, it stands to reason that there's no vertical line or buoy, pulling the gear around, caught up in ocean conditions. So that's been something that's been a pretty consistent comment from both the researchers and the fishermen, that the gear is more likely to be where it was set, and less likely to be influenced by tides, currents, and storms and things like that.
Sonny Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I just wanted to show everybody on my telephone that there's my gear or apparatus I'm using. Very high tech to me. You have a transducer, you have a deck box, and you have chargers to charge up the battery for the unit that's down and sitting on the bottom. But you can set it up on your plotter for each one of these. And I guess they're going to make it so that if you want to get an app or whatever it is, you can put it on your plotter, the draggers can, to show where all the gear is. When this thing pops up, I get an email from somewhere that says your buoy has popped up. When they were down there showing me all this high-tech stuff, I relayed to them that being in fishing business for as long as I have, when I first started, I use a frapping paddle for a bottom machine. Anybody knows what a frapping paddle is, please let me know. Thank you.
Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mike, for the presentation, your answers to all of our questions. I'm curious about one thing. How does the lending library work? Application process? Is it someone called you up and says, I'd like to try some of your gear? Just curious.
At this point, it's been fairly informal, and it has involved, reaching out to Henry Milliken, who is, head of the right whale, gear research, the on-demand gear at the center, and starting that conversation. The Science Center has an EFP where we have a lot of partner fishermen under currently. I believe we're at the capacity of that EFP, but there are certainly other solutions that we can think through. And I also should add that out of the nearly 200 units that are currently in the lending library, very few of them were purchased by NOAA. They've been donated by a variety of non-government organizations who have expressed support for the development of on-demand gear and have been looking for a way to help. And that's one easy way where we can direct folks who want to help is to fund the purchase of gear. Have it in our library, and we can get it on the water ASAP with fishermen who'd like to test it. So it's been a successful program. It's been fairly informal, but I will say that it's certainly demand for participation and access to the gear in the library has dramatically increased throughout this year, especially. But thus far, it's been a fairly informal process of getting in touch with Henry Milliken and his team who are leading the effort.
All right, thank you, Mike. Seeing no more questions from anyone, they will be taking feedback and from partners and stakeholders through December 31st of the year. So I'm sure, if they reach out to you, you'll email them back or call them, correct, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Alrighty. With that, I thank you very much for your presentation. And we're going to take about a 3-minute break to get set up for the next person. So KB McCardle, you're on deck, and we'll be back in a couple minutes. Thank you.
KB, if you're still on the line listening, do you want to test your audio for your presentation?
Yes, hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. You sound good.
Wonderful, thank you.
1 minute warning. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with our last agenda item this morning. We're going to do Northeast Fishery Science Center Fishery Monitoring and Research Divisional Update. David McCurdy, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you very, very much.
Can you
So,
speak
yes,
up just
again-
a little bit more?
Sure. Is this better?
Yes, it is. Whenever you're ready, we're ready.
So again, and I'll be update Fishery Monitoring Division. I am the branch chief of the please.
Did you shut your mic off?
No, can you hear me okay?
No, you're real quiet again.
Sir. That. That. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we heard you briefly and then you went right back down again. Steven's looking here to see if he can get you a better.
If you can't hear me, I can move to my colleague's office next door. She's also has it running.
Did somebody hear that? Because I couldn't.
Yeah, she's gonna move to another office where the presentation is running.
Okay. We'll just sit here waiting patiently and just when you're ready, just start talking.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay now? I'm using my colleague Bridget Harner's office.
Yes, that sounds a lot better.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry about that. Okay, so I'll start over. So again, my name is KB McCardle. I am the branch chief of the Fisheries Monitoring Operations Branch, and today I'll be giving a presentation for the Fishery Monitoring and Research Division update. Next slide, please. So the outline today that we'll be touching upon is just what our mission and organization does. I'll be touching upon 4 additional items: our data review process, the SBRM, the standard bycatch reporting methodology. I'll be giving a summary of our coverage accomplishments and also an update to our cooperative research branch. Next slide, please. So first is the introduction to our mission and organization. Next slide. Thank you. So our mission is that we collect information from commercial fisheries and support the use of that information to inform fishery science and management. We definitely bring the fisherman's perspective into the federal process through collaboratively producing scientific information. And we also strive to be a trusted presence among the fishing, scientific, and management communities. Next slide, please. Our division has 4 branches. We recently expanded within the last several years. So I run the Fisheries Monitoring Operation Branch. We also have a branch focused on the training, data processing and data quality. We have Dr. Anna Mercer, who runs our cooperative research branch, and Josh Lee, who runs our data and information systems branch. Amy Martins is our deputy division chief, and Amanda McCarty, she runs our division. However, she's been on a detail, is expected to return back in the spring of 2023. Next slide, please. This is the major projects that we work on within the branch. So starting from the left, looking at FMO, we mainly look towards observer support and operations. We do our sea day coordination. We work on achieving, to the best of our ability, working alongside our providers of our task sea days. We have bycatch reporting responsibilities, and we also run the dockside monitoring program. The training and data quality branch I touched upon before. This is our debriefers fall into that branch. All of our training components fall into that branch. Trip accounting, data entry, auditing, our electronic monitoring review, and our species verification and incidental takes. Our cooperative research branch is our bottom longline survey. We do our industry-based biosampling and study fleet, our Northeast Trial Advisory Panel, and then we have a bunch of oceanographic research, and this year, or I would say recently, we've been working on offshore wind impacts. Our data and information systems branch focuses on data modernization, management, database, and data management. We're working towards application development, systems integration, and constantly just staying on top of any sort of technology updates that are needed to occur within the division. And our administrative team is very important in that they help us with our budget, administrative works, and contracts and acquisitions. Next slide, please. Next, I'll touch upon our data review process. Next slide. So we developed something this year called the optimized review process. What this does, it basically allows us to redistribute effort by focusing limited resources on trips that need the most attention. So back in the summer of 2021, we lost several, I would say about half of a dozen of our debriefers. Because of that, and because of the impacts of COVID, we quickly realized that we needed to develop some efficiencies within our division in order to ensure that the same level of data quality standards were being met while creating more efficiencies to be able to process data in a more faster manner. So what this does is that it's working on clearing the current backlog of data. That loss of debriefers back in the summer of 2021 definitely impacted our ability to meet our typical data deadlines. So it also gave us a flexible process that is adaptable to change in the data landscape or unexpected challenges, such as losing an influx of observers. So what this review process does is that it basically sets trips in different tiers. So tier 1 and tier 2. All of our data is still going through an influx of thousands of audit checks, but there is a deeper dive into data if we're looking at reviewing incidental takes, if we have newer observers on trips, if we have observers who are struggling with something, we do basically a deeper dive with the quality of their data. So the selection criteria for tier 1 is basically looking at intakes, observer comments, age structures, and then the audits I was speaking of. And the selection criteria for tier 2, as I mentioned, are certification trips, which are trips by new observers who are new in the field. What we call priority or probationary status, so observers who need to be kept a closer eye on. The first time an observer would observe a gear type, they would go through this deeper review of a trip. And then we also have some additional thresholds that we put in place. What is nice about this is that we can basically adjust the knobs on how many trips fall into tier 2, depending on our resource and flexibilities. Next slide, please. So what this figure shows you is because of that impact of losing our debriefers, and we started to fall behind meeting our target deadline. So in this figure, the blue line represents our target of when we want to have data available to our end users. Typically, all of our data is fully processed, audited, reviewed, debriefed and loaded into our tables within 90 days of when that month ends. So you can see here with both our industry-funded Scallop program and our Northeast Fisheries Observer program that in the summer months of 2021, anything above that blue line is late data. Anything below that blue line is data that is available early. We started to fall behind. With the development of the optimized review process, the trend is that we're getting closer to that blue line and beginning to meet our deadlines. We are making some fast movement now, and we expect to be back to our typical standard data deadlines by the end of this calendar year, if not before. Next slide, please. So this is a training update. So we began to return to our on-site instruction in full classes. At the beginning of COVID, we were obviously, I think everybody was operating under a full remote training. Now we are back in the classroom for the most part. All of our new observers are attending class sessions in person. We did start to learn that with a remote or hybrid approach, some of our trainings in which we're certifying our current observers in new programs could benefit from a hybrid training as it saved time and resources, and we got the same results. We also outsourced our at-sea monitoring, which is our groundfish training program, to a third-party vendor through Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission. They partnered and awarded a contract to Coonamessett Farm Foundation, and that was to increase our training capacity for the upcoming increase in our at-sea monitoring groundfish coverage that began May 1st, 2022, from a 40% to 99% coverage. So in a future slide, you'll be able to see how that impacted our training schedule. Our training request and scheduling process update, we are projecting offering trainings further out to aid in the recruitment and planning for the providers so they know what's coming up and they know what to recruit for. And then we've also developed electronic monitoring reviewer trainings, both for our audit operational program and MRAM, which is currently operating under an EFP, which is scheduled to expire at the end of this calendar year, but move to an operational program under Amendment 23. Next slide, please. So this is just a table that shows you the training update and the amount of the output of our initial trainings. We define initial trainings as all new observers that are entering into one of our programs. We have the 4 programs that are demonstrated here is our at-sea monitoring groundfish program, our NEFOP, Northeast Fisheries Observer program, which is all of the SBRM, Standard Bycatch Reporting Methodology CDAY, so our CDAY schedule, our industry-funded Scallop program, and our electronic monitoring program. So you can see here that there's been an influx in 2020. Our program did shut down from March through August because of COVID. And we're not deploying any observers and not holding any trainings. And then we slowly began to build up the output and volume of trainings we were holding and are continuing that projection. And the table on the right shows the Coonamessett Farm at-sea monitoring groundfish training. Again, this was in order to prepare for an increased target coverage level that was beginning in May of 2022. So we started to, the providers started to recruit, and we started to hold those trainings early in order to increase our observer cadre as much as we possibly could. Next slide, please. The next portion of this is about our standard bycatch reporting methodology. As a reminder, this is our scientific infrastructure requirement in developing our coverage rates. There is an annual requirement to report to the council. However, due to COVID, we have not reported to the council since 2018. Next slide, please. So this is a revised SBRM Omnibus Amendment, was implemented in July of 2015. The SBRM amendment requires an annual discard report utilizing information obtained from both our Scallop and our CDAY schedule, SBRM, NEFOP programs, and for our 14 managed species groups and turtles, as sea turtles are considered fish under the MSA for the purposes of the SBRM. Each year, discard estimates and the variability are derived from the prior year data to inform observer coverage needs for the upcoming year. Next slide, please. So the 2022 SBRM recap. Because of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, no statistical analysis was conducted for the SBRM year 2022. A decision was made to use the 2020 SBRM statistical analysis, incorporating the 2022 budget and the 2022 scallop compensation rate for the observer C-Day allocation from April 22 to March of 23. This was mostly due to the lack of realized coverage that we had because of COVID. And also we had a bit of a backlog of data at the time. We do have an annual discard report in our C-Day schedule, which can be found at that link. Next slide, please. So our SBRM C-Days, our total C-Days needed was a little over 7,500. Those are based off our NEFSC C-Days, agency funded, a little over 6,000, and then also our industry funded scallop days. The SBRM includes a process that ratchets back the number of days based off of the available funding. So based off our funding, the total C-Days available was a little less than 6,000. And on that slide demonstrates how many are agency funded and how many are industry funded. But that was our target, or is our target for this fishing year. SBRM year, excuse me. Next slide, please. So this shows you the breakdown of the Mid-Atlantic and New England. The breakout is by our Marine Mammal Protection Act days and our SBRM days, as well as what we call our solicited trips. These are trips in which observers or our provider managers are looking for the effort at the dock, making calls, trying to find where the effort's occurring in order to achieve some task days. First, our call-in system, our pre-trip notification system, is a system that we have in the Northeast for the most part, and that is a requirement for both, for mostly the groundfish fleet, but also the herring and the scallop fleet as well. They don't all use the same call-in system, but there is a call-in requirement. So you can see here that our percent accomplished for Q1 was 88% for the SBRM, and the MMPA was 86%, and we're mid Q2 right now. So that will go through September 30th. We have not yet loaded the data, so we don't have all of our full numbers, but we're on track to achieve a similar realized coverage rate for both of those coverage types. Next slide, please. So our SBRM kickoff for the next year started on September 6th. That's where we begin to go over our timeline. We work with our GARFO partners, as well as our project partners and internal partners to make sure that we are set and ready to go with meeting our timelines. We try to identify any hurdles we may need to cross. With that, we have an analysis that comes out of the SBRM each year. For us, that's the discard estimation, precision and sample size analysis for fish. We also have the estimated bycatch of sea turtles. That's done, I believe, every 5 years. And then this year, we're working on our 3-year review of the SBRM as we move into next year. These are all analytical products and products of our SBRM work. We also provide additional deliverables, which is our annual discard report with our C-Day allocation, our C-Day schedule, which is made available publicly, and our trip selection report. Next slide, please. So these, you can jump to the next slide again, please. Thank you. So these are our 2018 to 2021. As I mentioned, we have not presented at the council since 2018. So this just gives you the overall coverage level. So you can see in summary that 2018 and 19 and now for 2021, our accomplishments have been fairly good. Obviously, we want to achieve as close to 100% as possible. The dip in coverage for 2020 was due to the observer program, observers not getting sent out to sea from March through August. So we're continuing to make headway, and we hope that the numbers will improve as we develop those efficiencies And now that we have debriefers back on track. Thank you. Next slide. This just demonstrates basically our task C days by each category. So if you look at the right-hand side, we basically have this separated out by Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And then if there's a PTNS written in that column, it basically means it's a call-in requirement or pre-trip notification system. So our SBRM days, portion of those have a call-in requirement, a portion of those are solicited trips. And then we also have our protected species PA days listed there as well. A portion of the MMPA days are also put into the PTNS. So this just demonstrates our percent accomplished in a different way than what I showed in the previous slide. Next slide, please. Our industry-funded SCALA. This basically just demonstrates the percent target achieved, separated by our limited access and general category fisheries. So as we continue to rebuild our cadre and our data processing staff, we continue to improve with our realized coverage rates. So this just demonstrates in the last 5 years where we have been. Next slide, please. This is just showing it in a different way with these tables. So again, the blue is demonstrating the limited access. The gray are the general category fleet is the general category fleet. And you can say, generally speaking, our realized coverage levels tend to be a little variable, but not too much. Next slide, please. So this is now moving from IFS, industry-funded SCALA. This is IFM, herring, industry-funded monitoring. So this is an update for this last quarter, or actually the current quarter that we're working on right now. So in 2021, our average coverage was 14%. In 2022, we were able to make some additional headway with that, and we're able to coverage close to 50% of that fleet. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the cooperative research overview. So the NEFSC's cooperative research branch, as I mentioned earlier, that sits within our division and is led by Dr. Anna Mercer. CRB's mission is to engage the fishing industry in research, to improve our understanding of the marine environment, and to inform fisheries management. CRB also works with any academic, nonprofit, and management partners to achieve its mission, including Mid-Atlantic Council staff and committees. Next slide, please. This graphic illustrates the cooperative research process as well as the types of cooperative research. The two-way flow of information is essential to every cooperative research project. I'll provide a few examples on the next slide. Next slide. So CRB, the Cooperative Research Branch, they spearhead a variety of research programs and projects, from fishery independent surveys to fishery dependent environmental monitoring and fishery data collection. They are also engaged in the NEFSC's offshore wind and fisheries efforts, including survey mitigation planning and evaluating impacts on fishing operations. CRB plays an active role in the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel, which is currently investigating the impact of a restrictor rope on survey catch. This slide includes the work that CRB leads, but if the council is interested in a more holistic or detailed presentation on cooperative research in the region, Dr. Anna Mercer can provide that at a future council meeting. Next slide. So sharing approaches, results, lessons learned is essential to the evolution of cooperative research, both in the Northeast and across the nation. So to that end, CRB will be hosting 2 cooperative research summits this winter to foster coordination and communication among the cooperative research community. The Mid-Atlantic Summit will be on January 31st at the Mariners Museum in Newport News. And these are one-day summits. They'll include presentations about ongoing cooperative research, group and panel discussions, and a poster and networking session. There is no cost to participate, but there is like a Google a simple Google form to register. And there are participation stipends that are available for on the water fishermen. And, CRB just hopes that anyone who's interested in cooperative research, even if they're not actively participating, will attend a summit and help chart a path forward. Next slide. I believe that's the end. Yeah, that is the end. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. If we could go back to slide 15 for a moment, that showed the ratio of the IFS versus funded fleets here. So if I'm looking at this correctly, the days needed has a ratio of just quickly maybe 85% to 15, and the days available shifts that ratio dramatically to more like 65-35. I'm just wondering if there's a message here. Is there an indicator of a problem? Is there an onus being shifted here to industry? And is there something we need to be looking at with our SBRM interaction because there is a shift occurring, or if this is just an indicator of something completely different?
So to answer that question comprehensively, I would have to get back to you and reach out to the analysts that work on the SBRM. But to answer that in a broad level, when we do the budget analysis to determine how many days we need, that's going to affect the agency-funded C days. The scallop compensation process to determine the industry-funded C days is separate from the SBRM analysis to take the SBRM budget lines and equate that to a number of days. So that's probably the broad answer, but I'm happy to get a more detailed answer from our analysis team, analytical team, to explain why those ratios change after it goes through the budget kind of ratchet process.
As a follow-up to that, would you be able to also provide retrospectively if this is something that we typically see and have seen in the past, or if this is something new? And again, that could be followed up with some memo to our executive director that could be distributed to us as council members if that's most appropriate.
Absolutely. Yep. I've made note of that.
Any more questions from the council? Any questions from the public? Catherine, you must have done a great job. No questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And with that, we're going to call this morning's session and we'll go to lunch, and everybody be back promptly at 1 o'clock so we can get the afternoon started and get done on time. Thank you.